Good evening, everyone. I'm Michelle Gray, the Director of Programming for the New York Times live conversation series, TimesTalks. For over 20 years, TimesTalks has paired New York Times journalists with the brightest and boldest creative minds from the fields of art, music, theatre, social justice, film, and of course, literature. I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's event with John Grisham, one of the world's best-selling authors, and Preet Bharara, the former United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York, who handled hundreds of cases involving narcotics, arms trafficking, public corruption, gang violence, organized crime, and civil rights violations. The duo will discuss Grisham's upcoming novel, The Guardians, about an innocent man who was framed, convicted, and sent to prison for life, and the group of lawyers whose mission it is to exonerate their clients who have been wrongfully convicted. Moderating tonight's conversation is Jim Dwyer, a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who is a reporter and columnist for the New York Times and the author of 6 nonfiction books. Before we begin tonight's program, we have a brief message from our lead sponsor, Citi. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Jim Dwyer, Preet Bharara, and John Grisham.
Thank you.
I'm glad the Yankees got rained out and you could all come tonight. Thank you. We're going to talk about John's wonderful and absorbing new book, but we're also going to talk about Preet's wonderful and absorbing and slightly less new book. And Preet, since you're the new author in this pantheon, tell me, what was it like to go from being the head of the greatest prosecutorial office in the world to being someone who was getting edited?
So it's a change.
Yes?
But I kind of enjoyed it. I'm lying.
Yes. I could see that.
You know, when you run a big office and you're the head of an organization, you don't do a lot of your own writing. You have other people who write briefs, and you look at them, and you edit them, and you supervise them. So this was the first time in a while that it's my words, virtually all of them. So it was a little intimidating, but I got through it. It's also interesting having been in that spot and now hosting a podcast. It's a little bit different.
Yes.
Stay tuned with Preet. You should listen to it.
Yes. And tell us the name of the podcast. And
Stay tuned with Preet.
Stay tuned with Preet.
As I often say to people, you know, if you're, because it wasn't mentioned, but I was fired by the President of the United States.
I mean, I don't want to do you one up, but he once wrote me a letter and said I was a third-rate journalist. So,
You know what? He literally, like an hour ago, it was reported that he called Nancy Pelosi a third-rate politician, so you're in good company.
she's on the way up.
As I say to people, you know, people ask about the state of the law, and they ask about the state of our democratic institutions and what it's like for the judiciary, for example. And I say, well, if you're a judge and you piss off the president, you keep your life tenure. If you're a U.S. attorney, you piss off the president, you get a podcast.
All right, we're gonna get into politics, but this is the GP part of the show, so we're going to talk just about writing for now. And John, this is. Let's see, there's been 7 children's books, 3 sports books, a nonfiction book, and 30-something legal thrillers. What is it like today getting edited as opposed to 40-something books ago? What's the difference when you turn in a book in what was the first year, 1980, 1970?
Time to Kill was turned in 1987 without a publisher, without a clue, and thank God it was edited. It was 1,000 pages long, and I had no idea what I was doing. I'd never written before. I'd worked on it for 3 years, and thought I knew what I was doing, and finally got lucky and found a publisher, found an agent, and then found a publisher. And so I sent the book to New York well long before the internet and all that kind of stuff. And it was 1,000 pages. And got a really good editor at a small press. And he cut a third of the book, which was painful.
Yeah.
It was a year of my life, and I'd worked on it.
Yeah.
And I said, I'm never doing that again. I'm gonna learn something here. I'm not gonna cut that much stuff in the future. I never have since then, because I learned, a very valuable lesson in writing popular fiction. When you start a story, you better know where you're going before you start. And I tell students, one of my rules is, do not write the first scene until you know the last scene. And I'm serious about that, because if you do that, you have to sort of outline and plan the whole book. And if you do that, then the book's going to be easier to write. You're not going to get in trouble. You're not going to get lost. So, as far as editing, I have never. I'm lucky. I have a great editor. My first editor at Doubleday published the first 5 or 6 books, David Gernert. And then my longtime agent died suddenly in 1995. And I went to David and I said, have you ever thought about being an agent? He said, no. And I said, well, you're going to be my agent, okay, because I need you to take charge. And so he still does the editing.
Uh-huh.
And we go through this process when the book is finally finished, and my wife, she edits first with a red pen. And
how long are you married?
Well, it's there are times when you wonder if you're going to survive, because she has some very strong opinions.
Yeah.
But she also has a very good ear for story and dialogue and character. If I can survive that, I'll clean it up and send it to David, and he does a complete page-by-page line edit. He doesn't change anything.
Yeah.
But he makes a lot of suggestions and points out a lot of things. So it's a process, and I still do it. A lot of writers sell a lot of books, and they reach a point to where they say, okay, here's the book, don't touch it. I'm late, it's 1,000 pages, I'm not going to edit. And you can sure tell it.
Yeah.
So editing is part of the process. It's not a whole lot of fun, but it's very important.
And there are some very popular brand name writers. You've never been tempted to franchise the Grisham name or byline and have a little team of Leonardo da Vinci students in there cranking out Mona Lisas for you?
No, I still write my own stuff, as weird as that may sound.
Yeah, that's very strange.
I just, I cannot believe, I don't know how people can write a book, put their name on it, and actually not write it, have somebody else to do that.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of it now.
Yeah.
I've given strict instructions to my family. If I were to pass away suddenly, do not publish books that I haven't written. Don't use my name to milk it for all you can. Knowing my kids, I'm really worried about that. So just stop publishing when I die.
I'm reminded of when Pete Rose, the great hitter and hopeless gambler, published his autobiography some years ago. One of the reporters asked him that. He said it was the first book he'd ever read, and he liked it.
I've given strict instructions to my children to publish lots of things in my name if I were to die suddenly.
Preet, just one other thing. We know Preet got started as a writer because his boss fired him.
Yeah.
What about you? Who fired you?
I never had a boss. I couldn't find a job out of law school.
Uh-huh.
For those of you who've read The Firm,
Yeah.
and I'm sure everybody has, although I will not ask. You may be shocked to learn I was not heavily recruited out of law school. Nobody offered me a job, and I was going back to my hometown anyway, a small town in Mississippi, because I wanted to run for the state legislature. I'd been planning that, and I just, went back and started my own office, and hung out my shingle and declared myself ready to sue, and had no clients.
Yeah.
So
Nobody ever slipped and fell in that little town?
Well, yeah, but there's always a lawyer to catch them. There was a lot of lawyers in town, a lot of competition. And I started writing because I was, after 5 years, I saw no future in the law.
Yeah.
And I really started writing because I had an idea for a story. And the story was a courtroom drama in a small town in Mississippi. You know, it was very autobiographical, and that eventually became A Time to Kill. Mm-hmm. And when A Time to Kill came out 30 years ago this year, it was a total flop. I mean, the book didn't sell. And they printed 5,000 hardback copies, and it didn't sell those. And so I told my wife, you know, I said, I'm going to do this one more time. This little secret hobby of mine, I'm going to try it once more. If that second book doesn't work, I'm going to say, forget this. I'm just going to go back and start suing people again. You know? And the second book was The Firm, and that changed everything overnight.
And had it been a thought of yours as a kid that you'd like to write?
Never thought about it. I was going to play baseball for the Cardinals.
Yeah.
Not the Yankees. We
Yeah.
didn't like the Yankees.
I was going to play for the Yankees, but I went to
You were going to play for
reporting.
the Yankees.
I was going, yeah, but I had to go to reporting instead.
You know, it wasn't unusual back then. Every kid on our block, we were going to play professional baseball. The Cardinals was a question of what position you were going to play. You know, and we loved our team and followed our team, and that was my only childhood dream, was to play professional sports, not write books.
Right. Preet, when you were in high school, you were on the, I guess, the public speaking team or the speech and debate team.
Yes.
And you referred to it as the nerd cover band.
Yeah. There was a category of, I write about this in the book, of public speaking, where you would recite a speech from memory that was delivered by someone else, which is the nerd version of covering a song, yes.
Yes, yeah. And tell me and tell folks about who Dr. Henry Street was and why that came to matter to you.
So I gave the speech, I think, for my entire sophomore year in high school, and it's a speech that is essentially a subset of the summation by the most famous criminal defense lawyer of all time, Clarence Darrow, in a case in the 1920s where a middle-class black family moved into a neighborhood where the white people didn't want them to be living there, and there was a mob that gathered around the house, and they were throwing stones at the house, and the Dr. Ossian Sweet and his brother, Henry Sweet, were defending their home, and because they were concerned for their life and limb, Henry Sweet fired into the crowd and killed a white man. And so he got arrested, he was charged with capital murder, and his life was on the line because the state was seeking the death penalty. He had the benefit that most people didn't have at the time of having said most famous criminal defense lawyer probably in history, Clarence Darrow, to come to his defense. And it's an impassioned plea at the end of his summation that I didn't fully appreciate when I was a pimply-faced 15-year-old, but I've come to really appreciate since. And I'll tell you what the theme is, and then I'll tell you what he said. And it's basically the inspiration for the book. You know, we spend a lot of time in this country, as we should, talking about the law and talking about how you can perfect the law and talking about what statutes you can improve and talking about what tools you should give prosecutors and defense lawyers and what criminal justice reform should be. And it's all about what the laws should be, which is great. And it is true that we say we are a nation of laws, not men, for very good reason, because you can't trust people always. But we lose sight of the fact that the only way that justice is ultimately done, no matter how well you've crafted the statute, no matter how well you've crafted your Constitution, unless the people are good, unless they have integrity, unless they're seeking justice ultimately, then it doesn't matter how good the laws are. You know, a well-written law doesn't guarantee justice any more than, you know, a good menu at a restaurant guarantees a good meal, or a good recipe guarantees an excellent meal. And Clarence Darrow said when he was defending his client from the death penalty on this murder charge, he was talking about the fate of African Americans in this country. And he says at one point, this is in the 1920s, so slavery was not that much in the distant past. He says, you know, the law has made him equal, meaning African Americans, but man has not. And the last analysis is, what has man done, not what has the law done? And then he further says, and this has been a mantra for me and a theme throughout the book and a little bit throughout my career as U.S. Attorney, and touches on some of the themes in John's book as well. He says, no matter what laws we pass, no matter what precautions we take, unless the people we meet are kindly and decent and human and liberty-loving, then there is no liberty. Freedom, he says, comes from human beings rather than from laws and institutions. And there's truth in that. So the laws are important, but as set out in John's book and in a couple of stories I tell in my book, if the people aren't doing the right thing, it doesn't matter how good your laws are, injustice will happen.
And you wanted to work in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Manhattan, where you did end up.
I did.
Your dreams came true. Was that okay?
It was more than okay. I got my dream job when I was in my early 30s, and then I got to lead the place where I had only hoped to be a lowly line prosecutor at the age of 40. So, I'm retired and doing my podcast and having a great time.
Yeah. And then you stopped answering the phone when the White House called.
Yeah, so are you asking me to tell that story? Look, another thing that's important.
Yes, tell the story.
That we talk about in the country is not just what the laws say, but what norms are. So, all this discussion about the rule of law and what equal justice before the law means and the independence of law enforcement, some of those are written into statutes and in the Constitution, but a lot of that is just tradition, right? It's how it's supposed to be. The way it's supposed to be in the country is you're not supposed to have the leader of the country call up a local prosecutor and say, you know what, there's this son of a bitch I don't like, why don't you raid his house, right? That's actually not in the law anywhere. That is a norm that you generally have observed in this country. Similarly, not to be overly political, but you're not supposed to call up the president of another country, hypothetically Ukraine, and do that. And but you have to have people who are prepared to say, like, you're not supposed to do that. And I like to think I'm one of those people who believes in the integrity and the independence of law enforcement, and that you don't mix politics and law enforcement. So some people may know, the president, when he was elected, before he became the president, he invited me to Trump Tower to ask me to stay on for another term. And I said yes, because I thought I was going to be left alone. And he called me a couple of times when he was the president-elect. And then on March 9th of 2017, the sitting president of the United States, Donald Trump, called me directly, through his secretary. And I didn't know what the call was about. I wasn't there. And I received a message. And it may seem odd, and I've had this debate with lots of people, that the person at whose pleasure you serve has the absolute right to fire me or hire someone else, calls you, you call that guy back, especially if it's a person who believes that he should be called back, and takes umbrage pretty easily. And I didn't, after a long discussion with my deputy, because I thought that the appearance of having this side conversation, and maybe future conversations, about God knows what. Worst case scenario, he's going to be like, you know what, that's a politician I don't like, why don't you go after him? And by the way, this is before we had evidence that he does this kind of thing on a regular basis. The spidey sense goes up. And even if it was innocuous, how is it going to look that there's a side conversation going on without the Justice Department, without the Attorney General? So, make a long story short, I didn't return the call, and 20 hours later I was asked for my resignation. And I can't prove that those things are connected, but they seem unlikely to be disconnected.
Right. One of the great powers in your book is your telling of stories of individual cases and bringing the law to human life. And that's, John, been your work since you started writing these books. And this latest one is no different. It feels very much like something that maybe did happen or could have happened. So why don't you tell us a little bit about the plot? There's a man killed, another man is arrested for it.
It's a wrongful conviction case. I'm kind of hung up on wrongful convictions, and it's really your fault. Because in December 2014, I was flipping through the New York Times.
2004.
What? 2004, not 14. And I came across the obituaries, which I really enjoy in the Times. I read, they're fascinating little biographies of people I've never heard of most of the time. And the lead obituary that day was a guy who had just died in Oklahoma, and he was my age, my race, my same neck of the woods. As it turned out, we had a lot of things in common. And his name was Ron Williamson, and the headline said, Ron Williamson, freed from death row, dies at the age of 53. And there was a photograph of Ron in court, in the courtroom in Ada, Oklahoma, on April the 15th of 1999, when he was exonerated, when the judge said, "You're free." And he was wearing an ill-fitting suit. He'd been mentally ill, and he looked like confused and bewildered. And so I read the obituary written by Jim Dwyer. And it's beautiful. And he started off by saying, Ronald Keith Williamson, who left his small town in Oklahoma with dreams of major league glory, but was later sent to death row and came within 5 days of being executed for a murder he did not commit, died last Saturday in a nursing home in Tulsa. He was 53. The cause was cirrhosis of the liver. That's what you wrote. And I spent a lot of time trying to write paragraphs like that hook you on the first page. I want you hooked on the first page. I want you hooked for 400 pages. But that was one hell of a hook. I read the entire obituary, and it got better and better. Ron came from a small town in Oklahoma, and he was a great baseball player, first-round pick of the Oakland A's in the 1972 draft. In his little section of Oklahoma, people thought he was the next Mickey Mantle. Mickey, as you know, is from Oklahoma. And Ron certainly thought so. Big athlete, big ego, and he flamed out in the minor leagues and started picking up bad habits and showing signs of mental illness, came back to his hometown, and was later framed for a murder and almost executed. But that was your obituary. And I read it twice, and I called my editor, publisher, Steve Rubin at Doubleday, and I said, "Have you seen the Times this morning?" Well, almost every New Yorker is going to say they've seen the Times that morning. Yeah. And I said, have you read the obituaries? And he said, no. I said, read the obituaries and call me right back. And he said, he did. And he said, this is a pretty amazing story. And I said, I'm on my way to Oklahoma. I have no idea what I'm doing. I've never done nonfiction. I don't know how to investigate. I don't know what I'm going to find there. And within a couple of hours, Ron left two sisters, one in Tulsa, one in Dallas. I tracked them down and talked to them on the phone, and had a hard time convincing them I was who I was, and I wanted to write their story. And I finally got through and took off to Oklahoma. And that's how I got into this world of wrongful convictions. I had never thought about wrongful convictions before. I'd never worried about it as a lawyer. I'd missed the first wave of DNA exonerations in the mid-1990s, in the 2000s. And I just, once I got there, I realized there are a lot of innocent people in prison. And that has bothered me for 15 years. Every wrongful conviction case is a fantastic story from a storytelling point of view because of the drama, the injustice, the suffering, the waste of life, the waste of money, the waste. One man serves a sentence while the real rapist or the real murderer is out there doing bad things. These are incredible cases, and there are thousands of them. And I'm fascinated by them. I'm on the board of the Innocence Project here, and have been for 10 years, and love the work. And that's why I've written several wrongful conviction stories, but I wanted to write one, this one, The Guardians, about a exoneration lawyer, an innocence lawyer, who would take a few cases at a time and investigate them and work them up. And I was inspired by a guy named Jim McCloskey, who started Centurion Ministries 45 years ago in Princeton. And it's a wonderful organization. They have exonerated over 60 people in the last 45 years. So that was my inspiration. And so I had a story.
Yeah.
I had a great story. And nothing, I don't care if it's the kid's book or a baseball book or a football book or whatever I'm writing, until the story's there, it's not going to happen.
And this story, so has a McCloskey type character.
Yeah.
And who's the protagonist of this, so to speak, the dead man walking?
Well, the wrongfully convicted guy is a black guy convicted in a small town in Florida, an all-white town just about, because that's, you know, they had to frame somebody. And it was a perfect frame job, and he'd been in prison for 22 years and serving time for a murder committed by somebody else. That's the factual scenario. I'm not going to give away the whole book, but the suspense comes because it's a case that maybe the guy got more than he bargains for. It was a very dangerous case because the real killer has been free for 22 years. He does not want the exoneration to take place. He wants the guy to stay in prison forever. Nobody's investigating. Nobody cares. It's been 22 years until our hero comes along. He's convinced his man is innocent. He's going to get him out, and that's when the like the Grisham suspense starts. You know, with dead bodies and things like that. You got to spice these things up a little bit.
I guess. Preet, there's a car abandoned near a train station in Spain, and it's found within hours of a series of bombings along the commuter lines going into Madrid. And there's fingerprints on it.
Yep.
And those fingerprints come back to a former United States Army captain who had served time in Europe and was now living in the Pacific Northwest, had converted to Islam, and was representing perhaps some radical Islamists, perhaps in the Northwest. And here were his fingerprints on a shopping bag. What happened?
So you jumped to the punchline a little bit there, but so it was the most devastating terrorist attack in Europe since World War II. It was March 11, 2004. They call it 3/11. In Europe, 191 people were killed. It was assumed at the time that the terrorist attacks had been carried out by radical Islamists in connection with jihad. And while everyone in the world is looking for the bad guys, some members of the Spanish National Police found this bag, blue bag with detonators in it, were able to lift one print. And I have an entire chapter about this in the book because it's a cautionary tale. They send it to the premier law enforcement agency in the world, the FBI. And the FBI folks send it to the lab and they start to examine it. And as you say, they came up with one match. And the reason they had this person's fingerprint in the database was because he had been honorably discharged from the military. And at first, they didn't know anything about the person, right? Because it's important to the moral of the story. They just see the match. And it was one fingerprint expert made the match, a second fingerprint expert made the match, and a third. So it was a triple confirmation that there were enough indicia of resemblance between the thing on the bag and this other thing in the database that it must be the guy. And then they look and see who the guy is, and he's a white lawyer in his early 30s named Brandon Mayfield, who's practicing law in Portland, Oregon, which makes not a lot of sense to them, because what's he doing there? And then they do a deeper dive and they realize, oh, he converted to Islam, he married a woman who was Muslim. At one point he represented someone in a child custody battle who had been accused and convicted of, I believe, material support for Al-Qaeda. So obviously they must have the right guy, because at first they were confused, and then they realized, well, now it all fits, right? It fits with the narrative. Meanwhile, the Spaniards never fully bought into the fingerprint match. They thought there were some issues with it. And the FBI was like, okay, Spanish people, you don't really know what you're doing. We're the experts on this. And they fought them. But the agents didn't arrest him yet. And by the way, the reason I mentioned it in the book is it was supposed to be my case. And I thought, this is a big case for a young prosecutor in 2004. And I was working the terrorism unit at the Southern District of New York. There was a turf battle between the SDNY and where this man lived, because we were the premier terrorism prosecutors in the country, still are. But the person was living, Brandon Mayfield was living in Portland, and there's another U.S. attorney in Oregon who wanted the case. And I remember going on a brief vacation during this period and reading in the newspaper that Brandon Mayfield had been taken into custody, and realized, I guess I'd lost that turf battle. And on that day, I was not happy that I had, because it would have been my case. But as they proceeded to do more investigation into him, they realized he had never left the country. There was no record of any connectivity between him and anyone in Europe or him and any other terrorists. And to make a long story short, the FBI messed up. And the reason the story is compelling is not because it's a story that you sometimes see and you sometimes see in novels and other places of a nefarious, ill-intentioned, racist, anti-Islamic person who wanted to pin some crime on someone they knew didn't do it or frame someone. I know that happens sometimes. But it seems to me more often, and something that's maybe we should be more concerned about and is more insidious, is just people falling down on the job. And instead of doing A class work, they do B class work. And when multiple people do that over time and across organizations, really serious injustice can be done. And it turns out that they couldn't find anything connecting him. But then, and they've got a FISA warrant on the guy. They were searching his home secretly at night and when he was out during the day. And at the end of the day, by the way, they never arrested the guy on charges. They brought him in on what was then still called a material witness warrant, because they had no proof of anything about this guy other than the fingerprint match, which they felt was not enough. So he's in custody for 2 weeks, 23-hour lockdown per day. And then the Spanish find the real guy, a guy named Daoud. And the Americans at the FBI realized, oh yeah, that seems like the right match. Now, the moral of the story, before you say, these guys are complete idiots, it turns out that Daoud, the actual perpetrator, and Brandon Mayfield have remarkably similar fingerprints. They just happen to, they're not identical, and one was clearly the match and the other wasn't. But based on people not following best practices, not being as rigorous as they should have been, not finding as many points of comparison as they might have, didn't get it right. And I think the lesson is also, people make mistakes. You can make a mistake. I think the real disaster here was not that they made the initial mistake, but they refused to reconsider their first mistake. Because everything told them, and there's a 300-page IG report that was an Inspector General report that was done about this, everything told them, well, we must have the right guy because he converted to Islam and he married a Muslim woman. So it fit a narrative, and they never went back and reconsidered. And one of the most difficult things for human beings to do in the legal context or otherwise is to reconsider an opinion once you have, scientists call, people who study these things call it confirmation bias. And they didn't do that in that case. And the result was this person had his life ruined for a period of time. The FBI did something that they never do. They apologized, and they paid him $2 million. And I think, the lesson that you need to take home in looking at cases like this is it's not just the corrupt, awful cop. It's also people who are generally good, who fall down on the job that cause bad things to happen.
I got a question for you.
Yeah.
So the attack was in Spain. The guy lived in Oregon.
Yeah.
Where's your jurisdiction?
Everywhere. You should do it. You should do your next novel about the U.S. Attorney's Office. I'm
researting now. I just started researching.
Take notes.
Somebody once asked me. I was meeting with an inspector general of some agency when I was in office, and he said once, like, "Remind me again what your jurisdiction is." And I said, "Are you familiar with Earth?" So we arrest all over my favorite stat from my time when I first became U.S. Attorney, and I would walk on the 9th floor, which was our terrorism folks, walk on the 5th floor, which had some of our cyber people. I'm like, where the hell is everybody? Nobody comes to work. We visited 45 to 48 countries every year. And so we did international narcotics cases, international cybercrime cases, money laundering cases, you name it. We did it. The case that's in the news now, right, where the reports are President Trump tried to get Rex Tillerson to tell the Justice Department to dismiss this case that was near and dear to President Erdogan of Turkey. To him was a gold trader from Turkey, Reza Zarrab, who we arrested on a sealed indictment when he decided to bring his family to Disney World a few years back. So yes, the reach of the arm of the Southern District is
that peculiar
broad.
just to the Southern District?
No, other districts, I think we do it more than other districts.
But you obviously you have statutory authority from somebody.
Yes. No, look, yeah, because I'll give you another example. We had a case where One U.S. Attorney's Office was handling it, I won't mention which. There was a plot to assassinate the Saudi ambassador to the U.S. And there was another district who was, I don't think was not as schooled in doing these kinds of national security cases. And the FBI grew unhappy and then reassigned the case to our district. And everything had happened elsewhere, right? The assassination was supposed to take place in D.C. The confidential informant was operating, I think, out of Texas. But there was, you'll appreciate this, there was a transfer of money to the person who was supposed to carry out the assassination that was routed through a bank in the Southern District of New York, and that was sufficient. So for venue to lie, all you need is something that happens in the Southern District of New York, and that is off. I once had a case where literally the only tie to the Southern District was that the plane carrying the guy who was supposed to pick up the heroin, also on the border in Texas, flew out of one of the Queens airports, but flew over the landmass. So that is the Southern District.
It doesn't take much to get you involved, right?
It does not.
Where there's a will. Yeah. Well, there was a Philadelphia politician who was not too. Well, he never drew an honest breath. And he used to say that if the FBI can't get me, they can't get anybody. He also had a saying, it was a piece of advice to other politicians, that it was never do anything crooked or evil that the average person can understand. And I've thought a lot about that as we navigate these incredibly complicated series of facts around Ukraine, but also Turkey. And I wouldn't mind, and I don't think our audience would mind at all, hearing a little bit more about this moment. Let's just set the scene. Rex Tillerson walks into the Oval Office for what he thinks is going to be his regular private meeting as the Secretary of State with the president. And sitting there are two lawyers. Now, they happen to be lawyers with very big pedigrees. One is Rudy Giuliani, and the other is Michael Mukasey, who's less well known, but also very prominent former Attorney General. And Trump, as the story goes, says to Mukasey and to Giuliani, tell Rex what you want. And what they want is to trade this guy that Preet's office has indicted for somebody who's in jail in Turkey. And Tillerson says, I can't do that. That would be illegal.
Good for him.
Is he right?
Yeah, I mean, I think, look.
Is it illegal? Why can't the president say this is a good thing for our country to do this kind of swap?
Yeah, look, it depends on the circumstances. So I have a couple of reactions. And by the way, to finish the story, as it was reported, he refused to do that thing. He went out in the hallway and ran into John Kelly, the chief of staff, and said, this is what I was asked to do. I don't want to do that thing. And John Kelly said, yeah, don't do that thing. and so that thing wasn't done. But there's some, look, I've said the following thing as a mantra since we're in phase 2 of sort of what Trump has done wrong after the Mueller investigation. And I might as well mention it here because you have asked a very good faith, legitimate question, which, is this thing unlawful? Does it break the law? And among other things, I'm a senior analyst on CNN, and given my prior career, when something happens in the news, I come on and someone asks me the question, is that a crime? Is that a crime? Is that a crime? Does that break the law? And I feel that a little bit, a tiny bit of responsibility along with a lot of other people in the buildup over the Mueller investigation, that we have in some way contributed to the idea that barring the full-on commission of a federal crime, all of which elements you can prove beyond a reasonable doubt to a jury, that everything is hunky-dory and the president, more power to you and be on your way. When that is not the standard that we hold the president to, both generally speaking as an electoral matter and also as an impeachment matter. So I decided after 2 years of opining on whether something was or was not a crime, to say, well, I don't know, it depends on what the circumstances are, but boy, if you have any brain in your head, you don't do that thing, as I said, and if you're asked to do it, you don't. And the great lesson of the Mueller report is in part that Donald Trump was saved from, maybe a stronger conclusion that he had committed crimes, because all these people, some of whom, by the way, I do not consider to be heroes and super virtuous public servants, said no. Like, you have Corey Lewandowski, who was not even a member of the government, saying, when asked, listen, you need to tell Jeff Sessions to unrecuse himself and to put the kibosh on all these things happening with the Mueller investigation. Corey Lewandowski, who has told the public that he has no obligation to tell the truth to the media, which means he says he has no obligation to tell the truth to the public. He thought, well, that's a bridge too far. You have John Bolton, who is not a superhero in my mind. And even when he starts hearing about these things, in a position like, there's a lot of people who have been in this Tillerson role that you described in the opening anecdote. And John Bolton, what kind of conduct is the president engaging in that you have all these all these heroic stories on the part of people who I think are not heroes? So I don't know if those things would be ultimately provable to be crimes, but they're clearly unethical, they're probably immoral, they're potentially impeachable, and they shouldn't happen.
John, in your excavations of, we're going to briefly depart the precincts of politics.
Well, thank you.
Unless you're still running for legislature down in Mississippi, is that over with?
I'm done.
Okay, all right. In your excavation of these cases, it is often less a matter of people deliberately wanting to frame someone as much as just kind of falling into place, falling into line. Or do I have that wrong? Are there more malignant actors out there than I think?
No, I think most policemen and most prosecutors, virtually all the ones I know, including are honest, hardworking people.
He's a former prosecutor.
Former prosecutor.
He's now a writer, so we have to exclude
I'm now
him
fully
from the
dishonest.
right.
No, but most of them,
Yeah.
most of them are, they play it straight. And most of them, it's very, very rare to have a situation where someone's deliberately framed or evidence is planted, that has happened. What happens almost all the time, you've got a sensational murder in a small town or a big city. And people are horrified by it. The community's terrified. They want the police to solve the crime, get the murderer off the street. There's enormous pressure on the police and prosecutors immediately to solve this crime. And what happens so often, and it's so frustrating, is oftentimes the police are not, maybe they don't use their best investigators. Maybe they're not that experienced. Maybe they're not that well trained. And they'll get tunnel vision. They'll decide, they'll look at this crime scene and they'll say, oh, well, this, and this, and we think that, there were two people involved. The story I wrote about, a young girl was raped and murdered, terrible crime scene, and it was really, really awful. And so the police on the spot said, okay, this is so violent, it had to be two men doing this. And they agreed right there with no evidence, and for 5 years, they tried to piece together a narrative that would include two men. And they finally arrested two men, they put them on trial, and they both went to death row. Ron Williamson and Dennis Fritz. Just because the police get tunnel vision, they go marching off the wrong direction. They tend to ignore evidence that is contrary to their theory. They're really enthusiastic about gathering facts that supports their theory, and they go off with these bad investigations.
And they had a hair examiner come in and say 17 hairs matched these two men that we later found out didn't match either of them. Is that right?
10 years later, with DNA testing, all 17 scalp and pubic hairs were excluded after an analyst, an expert from the Oklahoma State Crime Lab, told the jury that these matched Ron and Dennis.
Yeah.
And and the FBI, you're talking about the fingerprint, hair analysis has been wildly unreliable for 100 years.
Right.
It's so bad that the FBI just a few years ago, admitted that their own hair analyst, the FBI, the cream of the crop, the best of the best, were wrong 96% of the time. With hair analysis, okay? Right. You have bite mark analysis. You have all these experts. We had this horrible series of cases in Mississippi where this doctor who's doing all the autopsies in the state, and he had a sidekick who was a small town country dentist who wanted to testify as an expert. So he said, I'm an expert. And so they would have a theory of a murder. They would find the body. He would do the autopsy, and he would see bite marks on the skin, okay? And he'd call in his buddy, who would examine the bite marks, do a plaster cast of the favorite suspect's teeth, and it's a perfect match.
100% of the time.
Look, we don't know how many times they've done that. We don't know how many people are still in prison because of these two bozos. They cut a swath through Mississippi and Louisiana for 20 years, and they can testify. They testify all the time. They're smooth. They wear nice suits. The juries believe them because they're doctors and experts and all this. And the courtrooms are just filled with just junk science. And that's why I wanted to highlight a lot of that in this novel. And I really go after some of the experts who testify to blood spatter and hair analysis and things like that. We need national standards for forensics, and we don't have them. So you have a lot of really bad junk. A lot of these guys have been out of business now because of DNA. DNA came along 20 years ago and kind of cleaned up the science and really put these guys on their heels. And we have a lot of cases now where the original expert, they backed away from their testimony at trial, their opinions at trial, which sentenced the guy to prison.
Right.
We've got people serving 20, 30 years because of what some Jake-leg expert said in a trial in Podunk, Mississippi 30 years ago.
Yeah.
We can't get it unraveled. We're trying to get it unraveled, but junk science is a huge factor and cause for wrongful convictions.
But combined with, as you say in various stories in your book, if you have a really able advocate, you can pierce the junk science, you can pierce these experts who don't know what they're talking about, you can confuse them and impeach them properly. So the combination of the junk science and not good lawyers who know how to cross-examine these people properly is a bad combination. Yeah,
there are like 7 or 8 reasons for wrongful convictions, and bad defense lawyering is a big one. You wouldn't believe the cases where the defense lawyer at trial was somebody who never tried a murder case before, or defended someone who just got out of law school or volunteered for the case and has no experience. That's changing. Yep. It's changing rapidly in this country. That's why death verdicts are way down.
Right. Look, in the federal system, in the Southern District of New York, if there's a capital eligible case, there's a whole process. It has to be approved by main justice, and then you have to bring in a capital worthy lawyer to add to the defense team who has requisite experience, who has done these kinds of cases before. So there's a lot of care taken in that system, at least, to make sure that there's a really good lawyer who knows what it means to represent someone who may go to death row.
We're going to invite you up in a couple of minutes to put some questions to our guests, but I have a few more. One is, Preet, there has been first there's been, of course, tremendous work done in putting dangerous people behind bars or taking rich swindlers' money back from them a little bit. You have many billions of dollars in forfeiture to your account, not in your personal account, I assume.
Not, I hope not.
Please buy my book.
There's also a phenomenon of prosecutors not meeting their duty under a famous Supreme Court case called Brady, which requires prosecutors to turn over evidence that might be favorable to somebody who's being tried. And that's a persistent problem.
Huge problem.
And what is that about?
Quite frankly, I don't fully understand it. So sometimes it happens, there's a category, right, that we're talking about, and John talks about some of these kinds of things in the book, where you have just bad people, and they see stuff that's exculpatory for the defendant, they don't turn it over. That's the stuff of which movies are often made. There's another category where people sort of screw up. And it's not an excuse, where you have people who are overworked, and you have one prosecutor and they have 30 boxes of stuff that they get in discovery. They leave, they get reassigned, a new person comes in. They didn't realize that there were these 3 boxes that were related to that case. Some of it might have exculpatory material. That's a problem. It can cause injustice. It's not quite as intentional. But what I don't understand is the third category, which I think sometimes occurs, and that is where there's a deliberate decision not to turn something over, not because they're horrible and they're trying to frame someone, because they have come up with an argument that's sophisticated, because they're lawyers, that, you know what, this thing, based on our reading of the relevant precedent, is not relevant to a finding of exculpation or anything else, and we're not going to turn it over. And that I don't get for the following reason, because, and I think it's a culture problem in prosecutors' offices. And I had an early experience, I'll never forget. I had been one of these people. Someone had a case, small narcotics case. I inherited the case, and there was like a box of documents of phone records that were not really relevant to the central aspects of the case. And I think I made some representation that I had this stuff, and the defense lawyer calls me, and they know how to deal with young prosecutors who were terrified. And he started accusing me of stuff and saying I'm violating Brady and all this. And I'm like, all right, well, I need to call you back. And I went to my supervisor's office, and I said, and this is a very aggressive guy, generally speaking, for a prosecutor, one of the most aggressive people around. And I said, look, I'm looking at the Rule 16, and I'm not sure to. And he said, look, why are you even having this discussion? Do the documents hurt the case? And I said, no. He said, well, then turn them over. And by the way, if they did hurt your case, then you should really turn them over.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so from that experience as a junior prosecutor, I would articulate the principle that is not based on literal, textual close readings of cases. I would say, whenever there was a discussion about turning over evidence in my office, I would say if it takes 2 or 3 or 4 reasonably intelligent people more than 5 minutes to decide whether something should be turned over, then it must be turned over. With the one exception being, this is the other category where people get in trouble, with the one exception being, if the turning over the evidence at a particular stage you think would cause physical jeopardy to a witness. And that's where people get in a little bit of trouble, sometimes in good faith. But otherwise, if we're talking about it and there's an argument, the tie goes to the runner, you give it to the defense. And I think that needs to be part of the culture of all prosecutors' offices.
Okay, now come on down if you have some questions. I've got 2 more very, very important questions to ask. There's a microphone set up over here.
Oh, there you are.
One over here. And you're free to ask anything you want as long as the sentence ends with a question mark. Q&A, your part is Q, our part is A. John, I listen to your books often on road trips and things like that, and of course miles fly by, and it's wonderful reading and listening. What about movies? It feels like there haven't been a lot of Grisham movies. Am I mistaken about that? I know there's been several.
It's been 15 years.
And why is that?
Oh, I don't know. A lot of reasons.
You don't have to go into great, horrible depth about it.
Hollywood is a different place now, and they'd rather the perfect. Well, look how few smart adult films we get. Okay.
Yeah.
They're all making. The Hollywood model today is to spend $200 million to make Spider-Man 10,
Yeah.
and then that will, if it works, it will gross $1 billion in China. That's a pretty good model.
Right.
And $500 million around the rest of the world. They're making tons of money, and that's all they think about.
Right.
Making cartoons and fantasy films or whatever. And so you get very few good, smart dramas. So it's very frustrating.
Here's my other important question. Preet, there's a show, maybe some of you have seen it, called Billions.
Yeah.
I don't know what your role is exactly in this. How did you let them get away with putting Paul Giamatti in as the prosecutor?
Well, he's a very noted Indian American actor. Won various awards. Can I tell you the story that I always tell when people ask me about Billions?
Yes, please do.
And that is, I was very excited when they were making Billions. The producers reached out to me. I actually had dinner with Paul Giamatti. We went out to have a great meal, and he said, should we order wine? And I said, well, what should we get? He said, I don't know shit about wine. I'm like, how could you not know anything about wine? You were in that great movie. And you clearly know that you can't drink Merlot. I don't understand what the problem is. And he said it was going to be this great show, and I told my parents about it, because most most of these shows and the books and novels that get written are always about the DA. It's never about the United States Attorney. It's going to be about the United States Attorney, Southern District of New York. My parents are very excited. I'll make this quick. They tell all their friends. Preet's going to be, maybe depicted kind of a little bit in this movie. In this TV series. And so there's a lot of fanfare. They tell all their friends, many of whom are also conservative Indian immigrant families in the country. And then the first episode begins. How many have seen this? So for those of you who haven't seen it, the opening scene, scene 1 of Billions, episode 1, season 1, it opens up on a topless, on the ground, prone United States attorney played by Paul Giamatti, tied up. And a woman's stiletto heel appears in the scene, and it's obviously, it's an S&M scene. and she's smoking a cigarette, and she puts the cigarette out on the chest of the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York. And then to assuage his pain, she straddles him and engages in a bodily function. My parents have never mentioned the show again. That's a true story.
All right. I said that was an important question, and I'm glad I got it asked. Okay, I'm sure we have other more serious questions. Please. Again, keep it short, keep it sweet, or not sweet, but keep it short.
We all have our heroes. I was lucky enough to be on Elliot Richardson's staff in my 20s. He's a hero. Gregory Bateson, Joe Campbell. Who are your heroes?
Could we just say Elliot Richardson's role in modern history is that he was the Attorney General of the United States during the later years of the Nixon administration and refused. Why don't you go on and just say briefly what Elliot Richardson did that made him a hero?
Well, first I would say he was I think of him every day nowadays. He was a man of impeccable integrity.
Yes.
And I can tell you something that was missing in the campaign trail. He was one of the funniest men in America.
Right, but now about Watergate.
As Attorney General, the Saturday Night Massacre, Richard Nixon ordered him to fire his former law professor at Harvard, Archie Cox, and he refused. And he hated being remembered after that for not doing something, but for refusing to do something.
Interesting. Most of us would think that was doing something. But Preet, who are your legal heroes?
So, it's commonplace and popular to talk about someone famous that everyone knows about. But part of the reason I wrote the book was to talk about people that you don't know about. So everyone knows Rudy Giuliani was the U.S. attorney. Jim Comey was the U.S. attorney at one point. Some people know that I was the U.S. attorney. But, we didn't actually do anything. I oversaw the place, and hopefully I tended to it okay. But the stories that I tell are mostly not about me, which would encourage you to buy the book. And they're the everyday line prosecutors and agents and cops and investigators who were extraordinary people and inspired. I have a whole chapter early in the book, it might seem random to you, about a guy named Kenny McCabe, who is a hero of mine, who passed away some years ago, who was the New York City police officer, probably most responsible for helping to eradicate or at least diminish the influence of the mob, La Cosa Nostra, in New York City. He was one of the first people to go after John Gotti and did arrest after arrest after arrest, then became a federal investigator who worked exclusively with the U.S. Attorney's Office for the SDNY. And nobody knows his name, and nobody's made a movie about him. But he was a guy who I call him a brick-by-brick guy, who got up every morning and did some stuff that was extraordinary and required great physical courage and bravery. He was threatened by a lot of folks, but he did his job, made some extraordinary, a couple of things. He did his job in an honest and fair way, and he treated people well, even the bad guys. I spent some time with his son as I wanted to collect more stories to write about in the book. And literally to this day, his son Duke says he gets Christmas cards from people who Kenny McCabe either flipped, and in some cases, who didn't flip and prosecuted. and would get messages after Kenny McKay died, and members of the mob would say, it was an honor to be prosecuted to be arrested by your father.
Amazing. Now we're moving into a lightning round, so here we go.
Yes. Hi. First, I want to say hello to Preet, who I'm family friends with. So this question.
I told her to come up and give me an easy question.
A softball.
So I'm actually going to ask John.
Oh.
I
See, that's what's called a legitimate recusal.
I teach writing at Brooklyn Law School, and I just saw one of my students here actually in the audience, but we've done something new this year, which is that in our orientation program, we have all the students who are entering read Brian Stevenson's Just Mercy. And that orientation basically kind of flips on its head what law is about and what we're trying to inspire students to do. So I was wondering if you had advice, John and Preet both, for new students coming in and how we can help them understand rule of law and truth and those kinds of things as still being important now.
As opposed to how to write a novel. We were off to a very good start with that book because it's a tremendous book, and he's a great guy, and you know his career has been incredible. That's what I would tend to do, is find role models and heroes like Brian Stevenson. I wish I'd read that when I was a law student. Probably wouldn't change anything, but still, it's rewarding to know there are people out there with that type of courage who know the value and power of a license to practice law, and they do it the right way to help people.
Yeah, I would just echo that. You know, I think you want to explain to young people, whether they're law students or otherwise, that it is possible to make a difference if you're just one person. I have a show coming up, a live podcast show coming up in Denver with Shannon Watts, who started Mom's Demand on sensible gun regulation. The point, whatever you think about gun regulation, the point is Brian Stevenson or Shannon Watts, who's not a lawyer, they decided to do something about an issue that they cared about to make the world a little bit better, and they've accomplished a lot. And I'd like beginning lawyers to appreciate the power that their degree can have. Please.
Hey, by the way, I got a letter from John Gotti one time.
You did?
He was in prison,
Yeah.
and he read The Firm when it came out in 1991, and he wrote me a letter, and he said, really enjoyed your book. He said, I can tell you're from Mississippi because you don't know a damn thing about the mafia. And we corresponded for a while. I would say, thank you.
I hope your publisher used that as a blurb.
This question's for Mr. Grisham.
Yes, ma'am.
You were saying that you're involved with the Innocence Project, but your book, Guardians, is sort of based on Jim McCloskey's The Centurion Ministries.
Yes.
Will you be in the future involved with Centurion Ministries as well?
I don't know, maybe. I went to Princeton about 15 years ago and did a fundraiser for Jim. We had a big party one night. And it was really cool because he had about 15 of his guys there. I'm sorry, there was one woman and 15 or 16 of his men that he'd gotten out. He was solely responsible for, or the Centurion was solely responsible for these men being free, even being there. And it got pretty emotional. It's a big night. And I'm sure they'll ask me to do it again. I'm sure I'll do it. I'm happy to. The people ask me about the innocence stuff all the time. There's one big innocence project here in New York founded by Barry Scheck and Peter Neufeld. I'm on that board. And that's the biggest one in the country. And we litigate from coast to coast and take cases. And we now have, I think, 365, in the past 25 years, we have 365 DNA exonerations. And thank you. About a fourth of those came off of death row. Centurion is an independent, nonprofit that Jim founded 45 years ago. Great organization with lawyers and staff and a lot of clients. I think their number is like 62 or 63. There are about 50 innocence projects in the country. Anybody can start one. Most of them are affiliated with law schools. There are 2 or 3 here in the city. There's one in Virginia where I live, one in Mississippi that I helped to start. There's an independent one in New Orleans that is a fantastic advocacy group. They're up to like 25 people out of prison. So they'll pop up, they never have enough money. There's no money in any kind of government budget for this. It's not supposed to happen. You're not supposed to have, wrongfully convicted people. So you can't get any money. So we have to go out and raise it all. So money's always a struggle. The more money we raise, the more innocent people we can get out. So I'm always trying to help the Innocence Projects.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
I have a question for Mr. Grisham. I read almost all of your books and I'm a big fan. And I understand that you are very critical of the criminal justice system in the US, and I'm very curious if you could implement reforms, what would be your top 3 reforms you would, how you would change the criminal justice system?
I would eliminate the death penalty because it really bogs down the whole, it has for many years. And the death penalty is dying anyway for other reasons. I would surrender the war on drugs and say we lost that one and decriminalize, not legalize, but decriminalize a lot of narcotics charges. That leads to mass incarceration. We have 2.5 million people in prison now, and most of them are there for nonviolent offenses. There should be there should be a better way to do it. I do a lot of things. Just 3, I would stop all judicial elections, stop electing judges, keep politics out of the system, okay? So these races are so political. We have a package of about 8 or 9 legislative proposals at the Innocence Project that we introduce every year at every state legislature and try to get it passed. We're making a little bit of progress, but things like I would jailhouse snitches, informant testimony, put some serious restrictions, it's a huge problem. Put some serious restrictions on who can testify. Adopt a uniform forensic testimony standard. If you're going to testify as an expert in a capital murder trial about hair analysis or bite mark analysis, you've got to be qualified. Even fingerprint, you've got to be qualified for it. We don't have those qualifications. It's just whatever each state wants to do. What else? Oh, false confessions. A huge problem. We have 365 DNA exonerations right now with the Innocence Project. 25% involved false confessions. Because, the police know how to use abusive interrogation tactics and they can get confessions. Just video everything. The video machine's in the room. Turn it on. Show the judge and jury what you did. I could go for a long time, okay? Thank you.
Thanks. I don't quite know what the rules are. We're in extra innings.
We got 4 more. We can do them real quick.
Okay, we're going to do 4 real fast.
Okay, quickly, I want to say thank you for the 3 of you being here. My question will be for Mr. Preet Bharara. Without going too far to the left, I just want you to humor me, please. Is it possible that after 2019, going into 2020, we could see Trump in jail in orange? Is it possible to see him serve? I just need to understand if we say that the person who holds
You have no preference, right?
I know everything seems to be no longer law, it seems to be the norm. Can we put a president, a former president, in prison, is what I want to know. Is it possible?
So I'll give you the popular answer, and then I'll give you like a long, not a long answer, but yeah, sure, of course. You can. But I know we have other folks. Look, I think a lot will depend on, as a matter of law, absolutely. The OLC opinion that says you cannot charge a sitting president says explicitly it doesn't apply afterwards, right? And there are at least a couple of presidential candidates who have said, which I don't think is a good thing for a lot of reasons, that I may direct my attorney general to bring a prosecution against the president because we believe there's enough evidence in volume 2 of the Mueller report to set forth crimes of obstruction, et cetera. I think when you're talking about the President of the United States, it is a little bit more of a political matter, and we have a process that's going under, that's unfolding now in the Congress, and whether or not there'll be articles of impeachment or not, I think there likely will be. Whether there'll be a conviction in the Senate, I don't know. Most people think not, but we don't know. I mean, it seems like every minute of every day, there's more crazy stuff that's coming to light. So I wouldn't put that off the table just yet. And then the question is, depending on what happens with respect to this stuff, and depending on what the thing is that you might, reasonably charge the president with later, if there's an overlap between those things, there's an argument to be made, you go forward with a criminal case. There's also a reasonable argument, to be made, no matter who the president is, that there has been a process that's been adjudicated in a particular way, and you're going to have some prosecutor go back at it when, the Congress said no, which, is a reflection of what the people wanted. So I don't know. I think there's a reasonable argument. It's legally totally possible, and depending on what other stuff comes to light, absolutely. Will it happen or not? I don't know. It depends on who's elected the next president of the United States first. But the thing I will say is, I know a lot of people want to talk about the 25th Amendment, and they want to talk about Bob Mueller being the deus ex machina and remove this person that you don't like to have in the presidency. The election is 14 months away, 13 months away. The quickest and most efficient way to change the direction of the country is to vote for someone else.
Yes, sir.
I guess sort of related to that point. First of all, thank you all three for being here. Preet, I'm a big fan of your podcast. Just given your experience in working with some of the pillars of democracy and justice and all that, and understanding some of the inner workings there, how confident are you in recovery of some of these institutions, given the onslaught that we've seen during this presidency?
So I think it depends on, a lot on what I said a minute ago, and that is whether we have the re-election of the president or not. I had a really smart guy on the podcast, you may have heard, Ed Luce, columnist and journalist, who said, when asked this precise question that I put to him, and I put it to a lot of people, because it's easier to have other people answer the question, I said, what do you think will happen with all these institutions, the media, judiciary, equal application of law, the independence of law enforcement? So I think that democratic institutions in the country are pretty resilient, and I think they'll come back. And one term of this, whatever your view is, one term of this is an aberration, and you can kind of swing back more easily. 2 terms is something different, and I think that there will be clearly longer lasting effects, and I think bad effects, because you also will spawn other people. Well, this is the way to success. So if you have a certain kind of behavior that is then repudiated at the end of 4 years, I think you're going to get fewer copycats. And if it's not repudiated, you're going to get a lot more copycats, and I think that causes a greater problem. So I think it depends on what happens next November.
Thank you. I would just point out that every single day there are people coming to testify in Congress, although they've been instructed by the administration not to do so, and the Congress sends them a subpoena, and the people say, "Okay, here I come." So there's a lot of...
That's something different. That's
new.
There's
a lot of things going on within the institutions that are suggesting people are not accommodating the wishes of this particular transient group. Sir.
John, you took 3 years to write your first novel. You're now cranking out bestsellers at a rate of 1 a year.
2.
2 a year? What?
Could you talk about your writing process and how long you write every day, what time you start, and how you balance research and writing?
Yeah, it's pretty rigid. When I'm writing, which is I start writing a new legal thriller every year on January the 1st, and I give myself 6 months to July the 1st, and I'm almost always a week or 2 early. So I love to write January, February, and March because it's just a great time to write. And I have an office that's detached from the house, an old building, that's my writing cabin. And I go over there at 7 o'clock in the morning, and there's no phone, no fax, no internet, no music. It's just me and the keyboard and the computer. And I still love it. I still love to be over there every morning, writing, creating, piecing together legal thrillers and plots and stuff that I hope drives you crazy when you read the book, But it's still very enjoyable. I'll write from
7 a.m. to when?
About 11, about 4 hours. I have found over the years, when you write almost nonstop for 3 or 4 hours. Your brain pretty well turns to mush. And then I have to do something. I'll go for a long walk, go to the gym, do something physical. And I never go back in the afternoon, never go back at night. But I love that 7 o'clock moment.
Saturdays and Sundays too?
No, never. No, only during the deadline. I know how much I can do in the last 2 weeks. If I get a little bit behind, I can catch up at the end. But I'm determined to finish the first draft on time by July the 1st of every year. And then what will happen, I'll spend a month or so doing edits and polishing it up. And then by Labor Day, I'm bored and I start writing something else. I'll start writing a kid's book or love sports or some other type of novel. So I'm writing something else right now. So
This is horrifying.
I'm waiting for it.
Okay, yes, sir. Enough.
This question is actually for Preet Bharara, although I do love Mr. Grisham's books, the movies, movie version of them. Rainmaker, The Firm, kept me up many a night.
Thank you.
I just turned it on to try to get to sleep. Couldn't do it. And we do listen to your podcast.
Oh, good.
It's wonderful. I do enjoy your very intellectual approach to topics which make most of us mad as hell. Somehow you keep your cool. Question is, we've seen the question about the Watergate era, the Justice Department, and now we see this in spades. We have our Attorney General running all over the world doing crazy things and doing crazier things here. The question is, in their wisdom, why was it that the Founding Fathers, looking at the importance of checks and balances, why was the Justice Department not made part of the judiciary? In other words, why was the Attorney General not either appointed or elected by the justices of the Supreme Court and the Justice Department kept out of at least day-to-day politics?
That's a good question, a good one to end on, because I can't answer it. It's a reasonable question. And, people who are in this country who don't study comparative systems don't realize that in other places it's different. And this whole thing that makes me crazy and that is upsetting that we have to rely on norms for, which is a separation of politics and the Justice Department, is very difficult for people to understand, because a layperson will come on television, and I've had these debates on television myself, like, I don't understand. You serve at the pleasure of the president. He asked you to stay, but you didn't think it was cool to return the phone call. It's bizarre in a way, but it has worked fairly well. I mean, a lot of things, right? Not just this. A lot of things have worked fairly well over time, because it was not conceivable to the founders that you would have a person, I'll put my cards on the table, you not have a person of a particular bent and disposition, as George Conway, who I had on the podcast last week, calls narcissistic personality disorder. A lot of things were, George Washington and others, they believed that the process of election would require that a person who made it through that process and made it through all those hoops would be a person of the finest moral, upstanding character, and you didn't have to worry so much about these things. That you wouldn't expect a person who became the President of the United States of America, and all the difficulties that you see along the way, would dictate a letter to President Erdogan that you saw today, where he calls him a fool. Don't be a fool. Don't be a tough guy. And employ his personal lawyer, former U.S. Attorney Rudy Giuliani, to engage in shadow foreign policy all over the world. So I think there needs to be a reconsideration of some of those things. Maybe not as fundamental as removing the Justice Department from the executive branch, but there needs to be a fundamental reconsideration of these things, because sometimes elections don't go the way that the founders expected.
Well, thank you. I want to thank you for the questions, and I want to thank Preet and John for a great absorbing discussion. And two pretty darn good books. Thanks a lot. Good night.
Thank you. Enjoy it.
Thank you, sir.
Enjoy it, sir. Nice job. Nice job.
Well done. Well done. Don't lose your